In 1588, the biggest fleet Europe had ever seen set sail with one mission: conquer England. Now, the story of the Spanish Armada is one of those legendary tales, right? It's usually painted as this simple story of a tiny underdog taking on a massive giant. But today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that legend and see what was really going on. So, was this really a David versus Goliath moment for England? A miraculous victory against all odds? Or was the Spanish plan so incredibly flawed that its failure was pretty much baked in from the very beginning? That's the big question we're tackling here, getting past the myth to find out what actually happened. You know, at the heart of this whole thing, it really comes down to two people, two of the most powerful rulers in all of Europe, Elizabeth I and Philip II. Their ambitions, their goals, they were on a collision course. This wasn't just a battle between nations, it was personal. And that rivalry, it really boiled down to a huge conflict of interest. On one side, you've got Queen Elizabeth of England. She's actively funding Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule. And she's letting her sea captains, guys like the famous Sir Francis Drake, raid Spanish ships and colonies. On the other side is King Philip of Spain, and he has just had enough. His goal was simple: crush that Dutch revolt for good, and, put a stop to England's constant meddling. The Armada was his big, bold solution to solve both problems at once. So Philip gives the invasion plan, known as the Enterprise, the green light. But as we're about to see, the strategy he signed off on was, well, a logistical nightmare. It was this massive gamble that basically smashed two very different plans into one incredibly risky operation. Okay, so picture this. Philip has two proposals sitting on his desk. His #1 admiral, Santa Cruz, wants to build this enormous, totally self-sufficient invasion fleet from Spain. It's a solid plan, but super expensive. Then you have his best general, the Duke of Parma, who wants to do a quick surprise attack, sneaking his army across the channel from the Netherlands. A much riskier plan. So what does Philip do? He decides to do both. At the same time, he orders the Armada to sail all the way from Spain, meet up with Parma's army, and then escort them across. This meant the entire invasion depended on one ridiculously difficult rendezvous in enemy territory. Let's just break that down real quick. Step 1, a fleet of 120 ships sails to the English Channel. Okay, simple enough. Step 2, they have to find and link up with Parma's 30,000 soldiers, who are all waiting on these little barges. Step 3, the huge warships then protect these super vulnerable barges for the final crossing to England. I mean, on paper, it sounds pretty powerful. But in reality, it was just unbelievably complicated. And right here, this is the plan's fatal flaw. The one thing that dooms the whole operation. See, Parma's army was stuck in an area with no deep water ports. His little troop barges couldn't leave the shallow coastal waters. Meanwhile, the massive Spanish warships, the galleons, needed deep water and couldn't get anywhere close to the shore. To make it even worse, a fleet of Dutch ships was patrolling the coast, just waiting to attack any barges that tried to make a run for it. The two halves of the Spanish invasion force could never actually meet. It was physically impossible. So, the Armada sails into the English Channel, and the fighting kicks off. But this wasn't going to be a straight-up fight decided by who had more ships. Nope. This was a clash of technology, of strategy, and of tactics. And this is where the English had a surprising and decisive advantage. Now let's just bust a huge myth right here. This idea that the Spanish fleet was way, way bigger than the English one, it's just not true. If you look at the main frontline warships, the two sides were actually pretty evenly matched. The real difference was in their design and their battle plans. The Spanish ships were like these giant floating castles, built tall so their soldiers could board enemy ships. Their whole strategy was to get in close and fight hand-to-hand. The English ships, on the other hand, were these new race-built designs. They were lower to the water, they were faster, and they were packed with cannons designed to fire at a long range. Their goal wasn't to get close, it was to stay away and hammer the Spanish from a distance. So for about a week, you have this running battle all the way up the English Channel. The Spanish adopted this incredible defensive crescent formation. It was so effective, the English cannons just couldn't break through it. The Armada just kept moving, relentlessly, until on August 6th, it dropped anchor off the coast of Calais, in France, to wait for word from the Duke of Parma. And so they waited. The most powerful fleet in the world just sitting there, anchored in a tight formation, totally exposed. The Spanish commander, Medina Sidonia, was sending frantic messages to Parma. But because of that fatal flaw we talked about, Parma and his army were completely stuck. They couldn't get out. Word was never going to come. Meanwhile, the English commanders, Lord Howard and Sir Francis Drake, they looked out at this anchored fleet, and they saw their chance. They knew their cannons couldn't break that formation. But with the Armada just sitting there, immobile, it was the perfect target for a completely different kind of weapon, a much more terrifying weapon. In the dead of night, the English did something brilliant and terrifying. They took 8 of their own ships, packed them with anything that would burn, tar, gunpowder, you name it, set them on fire, and just sent them drifting with the wind and tide straight into the heart of the anchored Armada. The Spanish captains freaked out. They were afraid these were hellburners, ships packed with massive explosives. In a total panic, they cut their anchor cables to escape, and in that chaos, their unbreakable crescent formation was completely shattered. The battle that happened the next day, the Battle of Gravelines, was a brutal, close-quarters slugfest. But the Armada's real enemy hadn't even shown up yet. With their formation broken and absolutely no hope of meeting up with Parma, the Spanish were forced to retreat. Their only way home was the long way, north, all the way around Scotland and Ireland, and that's when the weather turned on them. This number, it's just staggering. Out of the 30,000 men who set sail from Spain, only about half of them ever made it back home. And here's the craziest part. Most of those men didn't die in battle. They died during that horrific journey home, from storms, from disease, and from starvation. So why was the retreat so deadly? Well, first off, the ships were already pretty beaten up from all the fighting. Then, a series of just terrible storms slammed into them. But the third reason is a key detail people often miss. Their food and water was already going bad. And why? Because the year before, Sir Francis Drake had led a raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz and burned thousands of barrel staves, the wood needed to make good solid barrels. This meant the Armada had to use poorly made green wood barrels, which leaked and couldn't keep their food and water fresh for the long trip. Drake's raid from a year earlier had a direct and absolutely deadly impact on the sailors of the Armada. So, what did the defeat of the Armada actually mean? It's really easy to overstate its importance, to get caught up in the legend. But the true legacy is a bit more complicated, and honestly, a lot more interesting. The biggest and most immediate impact wasn't military. It was psychological. For decades, Spain had seemed completely unstoppable. So for Protestant nations like England and the Dutch Republic, seeing the Invincible Armada defeated, well, they saw it as a sign that God was on their side. It was this massive morale boost that energized them in their long fight against Spain. So, what were the real, concrete consequences? First, the Armada's failure almost certainly saved the Dutch revolt from being totally crushed. It also forced Spain to pour a ton of money and resources into the war against England, which started to shift the balance of power in Europe. But let's be super clear about the biggest myth of all. This defeat did not end Spain's naval power, not by a long shot. Far from being crushed, Philip II immediately started a huge shipbuilding program to replace his losses and make his navy even stronger. In fact, he launched 2 more armadas against England in the 1590s. The war dragged on for years, finally ending in a stalemate in 1604. Spain remained a dominant sea power for a long, long time after 1580. So, if the defeat of the Armada wasn't the end of the Spanish Empire, then what was it? Well, maybe its true legacy was the shattering of an idea. It proved that Spain, for all its immense power and wealth, was not invincible. It could be beaten. And that realization, that changed the way everyone thought about power in Europe forever.